is Basic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
I left the meeting, went directly back to my cubicle, called the programmer, and said, "There's been a little hiccup."
This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Gary Furr was product manager for productivity software for the Atari home computer division, where his claim to fame was being the manager for the AtariWriter word processor. He also published a set of AtariWriter printer drivers, which were first published through Atari Program Exchange. The product first appeared in the fall 1983 APX catalog with support for about 10 printers, then later was sold directly by Gary and eventually grew to support about 150 printers. After Atari, Gary worked at Datasoft. This interview took place on August 29, 2016.
By training, I am an aerospace engineer. I went to NC State University and I got my bachelor's degree in 71 and then went into the ROTC and proceeded with a master's degree, and I graduated in 1973 and was commissioned with the Air Force in 1973 and got my master's degree on the same day. And I had been married the year before that, so my wife and I were stationed at a little place called Sunnyvale, California, at a 9-story building that contained the satellite control facility for the Air Force, and that is at the corner of highways 237 and 101, which all Silicon Valley people will know now is populated mostly by Google, because I looked on Google Maps a while back, and it looks like the entire area is owned by Google. But I was in the Air Force in Sunnyvale from 73 to 77, and then I got out of the Air Force and went to work for Boeing in Seattle. And by the time I got out of the Air Force, processed out, got a home in Seattle, moved to Seattle, President Jimmy Carter had canceled the B-1 avionics program that I was going to go to work for on the avionics project. And so when I arrived at Boeing, basically my job was being phased out. So I looked around Boeing and got another job with the Boeing Computer Services Group. And for almost 3 years then, I managed all the application software, both acquiring and installing and detailing the operations of the application software that all the Boeing engineers used to design the 757, 67, and 77 aircraft. But during those years, from 77 to 1980, I had become more interested in what was happening back down in California, in Silicon Valley, and all of the things that were going on with home computers and computers in general. And so one night I got a call from an Air Force buddy who had gone to work for GT Sylvania Government Systems, and he said, "Geez, you know, we need your expertise down here. Why don't you come and interview?" Which I jumped at the chance to do. So went down, interviewed, got an offer, and we started moving back down to California. And for a time then, I worked at the GT Government Systems, and a lot of people there were from my old Air Force days, and some of those people in about early 81 began working, leaving GT Sylvania and went to Atari. So after they had been at Atari for 6 to maybe 9 months, they called me up one day and said, "You know, we'd like to have you come to work for us." So went over and interviewed at Atari and had an offer, went to Atari. So that was in the late fall of 1981. So in both all the Air Force, Boeing, and GTE. A lot of what I did involved word processing, text editing, developing, designing software for the systems that we were integrating. And so the people that hired me knew my background, and we almost, from the beginning, began talking about replacing the Atari word processor, which was the product that was being sold at the time on the 400 and 800 computers. So sometime in late 81 and very early 82, we formulated the basis for beginning the work to design and develop what became known as AtariWriter, the cartridge word processor. And so the design spec was written by myself sometime in the March, possibly April timeframe of 1982. And a month or two after that, it was decided that there were not sufficient programmers available in the home computer division to actually do the programming at the time, because they were all busy doing other projects. So we contracted to have the programming of the product done at Datasoft. Datasoft was then a company out of the LA area, from Northridge, I believe, that already had a lot of Atari products, as well as other products or products on other computers like Apple and Commodore and Radio Shack and so on. So we contracted with Datasoft to do the actual programming of the product, and that proceeded throughout the summer of 82. And into the fall, we began sort of a prototype testing project inside the home computer division, whereby I would take probably, I recall, somewhere around 40 or 50 cartridges that we generated, along with what I had developed as the early stage of the user's manual, and we gave them to secretaries and other program managers and some managers so that they could begin using the product, and we got some experience, understanding what was right and what was wrong or what needed to be tweaked. So throughout the late summer, early fall, and into the late fall of 82, we were doing that testing inside Atari, inside the home computer division, and I was running around chasing, what ifs and what key sequence do I use here, and how do I do this, and how do I get out of that. And so I was refining the user's manual as we were going along, and I realized that there was a need for something like a quick reference card, so I generated that for myself, and then as we got into the discussions about the actual product, we took the quick reference card and turned it into an actual professionally prepared quick reference card that we included in the product box. But we went into the winter and spring then of 1983, finishing up the project and doing the final testing and everything. And sometime in probably the maybe February or early March time frame of 1983, we had a status meeting that was called by the president of the home computer division, whose name I don't recall any longer. But there were probably 10 or 12 people in the room, and various disciplines from manufacturing and sales and marketing and other groups, people that had been working testing the product as I was running around the company answering questions. And I was briefing the status of the development And I got to the point where I was describing how we were going to deal with printers. And you recall that we're displaying all of the text on a standard color television, and so we're limited in the amount of space that we had available for putting up printer types. And we had designed a set of printers. We had 4 printers defined. I think the 825 was the most popular printer at the time, and there was a new printer being produced, the 1025, I believe the number was, and there were a couple other printers, the Atari 820 and the 822, one of which was a very narrow form factor inkjet, if I recall. I don't remember if that was the 820 or the 822.
Right, the one with that was like 40 columns of paper roll or something silly like that, right?
Yes, and it was like a 2 or 3 inch wide paper roll, and it's almost like the products these days that print labels. But anyway, it was a printer, and it was a useful printer at the time, but it was the least likely of the printers to be used by anybody using this tool for word processing. So I surmised in my design document that the right thing to do would be to load a printer driver from an external floppy disk and replace that one printer with whatever that printer definition would be. And so I was describing this process in this particular meeting, and at the time the home computer division president slammed his hand down on the table and in a fairly loud voice said, "No, absolutely not. There is no way we're going to support non-Atari hardware in this product. We will not do that. You will not have that." And whereupon, in my youth, I may have said something that I probably should not have said back to him, which could have involved words like stupid or idiot or other words that you might not use these days if you're thinking properly at the right time. But we ended the session with me agreeing that, yes, in fact, we would only support those 4 printers that were defined in the user's manual and that were, at the time, the top-selling printers that Atari was using. So I left the meeting, went directly back to my cubicle, called the programmer, and said, "There's been a little hiccup, and what we're going to do is we'll support the 4 printers that are on the screen, but instead of loading a printer driver and replacing number 4 with whatever the new printer might be, like, for example, an Epson or Smith Corona or any of the others that happen to be popular at the time, we'll just load a printer driver from the floppy disk, and when somebody hits the P key to print, we'll print using that printer driver." So that's the way the product was designed, or went out the door as the final product. But what we did, actually, in the user's manual, we decided that we would basically put a paragraph in the back that said, if you don't have an Atari printer, you can acquire a printer driver from the Atari Program Exchange. And that's the way it was left. There was no further explanation, but everybody at the time knew what the Atari Program Exchange was. So the product was developed, and it was manufactured and put in the warehouse, and very shortly after the products were developed in the warehouse, I submitted my resignation from Atari and went to work as a general manager of the Northern California branch of Datasoft. So that's the whole sequence of how we got where we are.
Okay. I have many questions.
Please.
All right. Well, first of all, I'm going to go in the backwards order here. Why did you leave Atari?
Well, to be very honest, I left Atari because it wasn't in the best of relationship with the president of the home computer division.
Mm-hmm.
So my credibility as a software program manager, product manager, basically had been shattered. And even though I did have other projects that I was working on at the time, I decided that it was probably the most prudent thing to do to leave Atari and go to work for Datasoft, who, as I mentioned previously, had been the contractor that actually programmed the guts of the AtariWriter.
Right. And what year did you leave?
That was in the spring of '83, probably April of '83.
Okay. All right. So going back, you said that you wrote the specs for AtariWriter, and I'd like to know more about that. Clearly, you had a lot of experience with other probably mainframe professional type word processors, so I'm curious about the specs that you wrote and if there were things that were not possible on the Atari machines or things that had to get left out. Had you seen TextWizard, which was the Datasoft word processor, and were you already familiar with that? And just kind of tell me about that process of speccing it out.
Well, I was not 100% familiar with the Datasoft product, but I knew there was a product, and the product, the programmer on that product was the same programmer that did the work on the AtariWriter.
Right. Well, William Robinson.
So I'm sorry?
William Robinson.
Okay. I'm sorry, I don't remember the names, but that sounds good. The process that we went through was inside Atari reviewing the Atari word processor and its keystrokes and combinations, and deciding how many of those we were going to keep and how many of those we needed to replace, and somewhat drawing on part of my experience in the Air Force and Boeing and GTE using other common word processors, and what I felt was, more or less the right thing to do in setting up control sequences, using control key plus other keys to control C, for example, to center the text, and working within the limitations of what we had at the time. So I started writing the design document by just jotting down and keeping track of all of the combinations of keys and things that we wanted to keep from the Atari word processor. And we got into discussions with Datasoft about the contracting the actual programming. So they said, well, let's look at the product that they had. And so I looked at their product and their key sequences and what was good and what I thought was going to sustain a good word processor. And over the Easter holiday in 1982, I basically worked nonstop from probably Thursday of that week until at least Sunday night, doing nothing but just heads down in my bedroom writing. And, of course, in those days, Atari gave all of the employees systems, so I had an 800 with 2 floppy disks and an 825 printer and a TV, 19-inch color TV that I had. So I was set up in what I would call my computer room, and my wife was away in North Carolina with her parents at the time, so I was all alone and could spend as much time as I wanted, and I wrote the specs. and took them back the following week and began discussions with everybody in the computer group, including the marketing people and other people in my group, about what I had written and why I did, and it simply evolved from there. And I took the initial design document and fairly early on began writing the drafts of the user's manuals.
Okay. Again, you were doing that on the old Atari word processor, I assume?
We did the entire spec on the old Atari word processor because we didn't have any product to use except into the fall and late fall of 1982.
I read on Wikipedia, which is never wrong, that I think it said that you said that about 800,000 copies of AtariWriter sold over its life. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, the number that I was given by some people inside Atari was that the original AtariWriter, the one that I had written the specs for, sold approximately 800,000 copies.
Wow.
And that didn't include any of the newer models, or the foreign language versions, which we were contracted to do after I left Atari and went to work for Datasoft. Then I was contracted by Atari, and we programmed the French, German, Italian, and Spanish versions of AtariWriter. And then there was an upgrade to AtariWriter later, I think somewhere in around the 84 time frame, maybe late 84.
I think you're talking about AtariWriter Plus.
I believe that's true, and the part of that upgrade was actually done under contract with the people that work for me at Datasoft.
So that's interesting. So, that you were working on AtariWriter at Atari, and then you were working on AtariWriter at Datasoft. It's like AtariWriter was a big part of your life for a long time, whether you wanted it to be or not.
Well, it was a long time, and it was much longer when you look at what I did with the printer drivers.
Right.
Because I didn't start writing the printer drivers until after I left Atari and went to work for Datasoft, but I did the work basically in my bedroom, computer room at home, and produced the first copies for the Apex, and they began selling the printer drivers as a single disc with, I think, either 10 or 15, I don't remember the exact number, but a number of printer drivers on a single disc.
Right, it looks like 10 or 11. I'm looking at the catalog here.
And a lot of those, if not the majority of those, were sold to people in users groups who would go to user group meetings and share the floppy disk with all of the friends and all of the people in the user group. So between 1983 and 1993, I personally sold about 25,000 copies out of my home.
Wow.
And I set up, with the IRS, a sole proprietorship as a business. And so I personally sold those. And toward the end, I was only selling a few. The last single copy was sold in 1983.
Wow.
And then towards the late 90s, I got a call from a user group in Pennsylvania. I believe they wanted me to write a new driver for a new printer they had. And I said, well, it's been a while since I've actually created one. And we had a little discussion, and basically it resulted in boxing up all the code and all the floppy disk and all the cartridges and shipping the entire set up to this user group. And my wife was pleased because she got her closet back.
So you said you sold about 25,000 copies. Was this after Apex went belly up that you were still selling them?
Yeah. I didn't sell any until Apex went belly up, and that's why I basically started selling them myself, because I knew that there was still a need, and so I just ramped up and began producing my own users manuals and my own, if you can call it a marketing literature, but it was just basically, if I recall, a single sheet with a list of printers on it. But I sold them to individuals, and the deal was, if you wanted a new printer supported, you had to send me a copy of your user's manual, and I would send you the printer driver for that, and I would be able to sell the printer driver if anybody else asked for that model printer.
Nice. So what was involved in creating a printer driver? Was it just putting the special codes into some sort of format, or was there a lot of programming involved?
Yeah, basically, no, there wasn't an awful lot of programming involved. The programmer, the initial programmer from Datasoft, gave me a printout of what a printer driver would look like, and I had a compiler, and so I generated the code, placing whatever the proper codes were for the individual printers into the right slots, and compile that into a file, and that was the individual file that got loaded onto the floppy disk and sold to support whatever the printer was. Mm-hmm. So there were 20 or 30 parameters that I would look at in any given printer. So that's why I wanted a copy of the user's manual, because at that time, all of the manuals had a section in the back that listed all of the codes for the individual items. What code would it take to bold? What code would it take to do an italics? What code would it take to underline, etc.?
So it sounds like you just pushed a lot of these out the door untested, and
well, I
couldn't own all
not,
these printers.
I would send the driver back to the individual with the provision that they would tell me if there was any problems, and they would always communicate back to me that everything worked fine, or it didn't work, or whatever. Mm-hmm. But I would not sell anything that I had not received some sort of confirmation from the individual
Nice.
that the particular product worked correctly.
Nice.
There were people sending me these manuals literally from all over the world, and at one point in the mid-'80s, maybe probably 86 or 87, I got a request from the Army to supply their commissaries with sets of these printer drivers. And when I sold printer drivers in that particular fashion, whether I sold them to a computer shop or to the Army commissaries, I would not sell a disk with a whole bunch of printer drivers on it, because there was no protection.
Right.
And as I said, Atari sold 800,000 copies, and I sold 25,000 myself. I don't know how many copies that Apex sold. I don't think I was ever given a number of how many they actually sold. But copyright was a thing that I didn't have the leisure of dealing with. I would sell cards to the commissary or to computer stores, and if you bought one of these printer drivers, you didn't go home with a floppy disk. You went home with a postcard that you mailed to me at my address and told me which printer you have, and then I mailed the floppy disk back to the individual.
Did you sell a lot of discs that way? I mean, through the Army? That seems just such a unique way to sell things.
A total of... Well, I never knew really, frankly, whether they were coming from the Army or from, a store in Oregon or a store in Dallas or somewhere else. I just got a postcard.
I see. So the original version of the printer drivers had, I think, like I said, 10 or 11 drivers on it. And then in later descriptions on the internet, I found descriptions where they said there was dozens of drivers, and then another description said there was like 100 drivers. It sounds like you made a lot of drivers. Any?
Well, I ended up. I believe I counted in. Like I said, the last time I sold an individual driver was 1993, and I counted the number of files that I sent to the user group in Pennsylvania. I think there was on the order of 159 individual files.
Wow.
So at the end, I had created something on the order of over 150 individual drivers.
Wow. And every time you sold a disc, was it sort of a mental FU to that manager who didn't want drivers?
Well, no. I sometimes I wish I could stand back in front of him and say, look at this decision. But it's really, I really don't think that way too many times. It's all in the past, and
sure.
I knew, or at least I thought that I knew at the time, that it was the right thing to do because I knew that Atari had good printers, and I didn't want to take anything away from their product, but I knew that people were buying hardware and were going to buy other kinds of printers. They simply were not going to be limited in buying hardware, specifically printers, from Atari. So I wanted to give the customer the best deal possible, and to be honest, I knew that AtariWriter was a good product for the time, and I wanted it to be used. So that was my decision, and I think ultimately it was a good decision, and I'm sure that more than 25 or 30,000 people enjoyed the fact that I made that decision at that point in time.
Sure. Yeah, with piracy and everything. I bet you made some serious money off this product, I bet.
Well, I didn't make a lot of money. I sold the individual drivers for $10.
Mm-hmm.
And I sold to stores and to the Army for $6 because they had to sell the product for $10 because that's what I put on all of the individual, I don't know, maybe one, not gallon baggies, but the way I sold them was, I would sell them in a cellophane baggie, and if a store in Oregon wanted 10 copies, they got 10 baggies with something, like a marketing sheet and a postcard. But I sold those for $6 so that they could make a profit selling it for 10. And I think I made probably $4 profit on each one.
Cool.
After you count for the postage and the mailer and the diskettes, because I had to buy floppy disk and sleeves for the disk and the mailers and then the postage and running back and forth to the post office, etc.
Sure, absolutely, I get it. Let's see. So, all right. So you ended up at Datasoft. Let's talk about your time there a little bit.
Well, Datasoft offered me the position of general manager of a Northern California branch. And so I set out, after I left Atari, to hire a number of programmers, which ultimately reached the number, I think, either 12 or 14. I don't recall. I think it's a higher number. It was somewhere around 14 people that were what you call whiz-kid programmers at the time. And ultimately, I hired 2 program managers to manage all the projects that we had. I hired a digital graphic artist, and an office manager, because that was a lot of kids to keep in line. So she was kind of like a den mother, while I was sort of running the office in general, and she kept everybody running properly.
Mm-hmm.
We worked on a lot of different platforms, because that's what Datasoft wanted to produce. We produced a number of video games on a number of different platforms, including Atari, Commodore, Radio Shack. We did Apple II, and then later in '83 and early '84, we did Macintosh software, and we also did some software for the graphics platform called Mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And we were under contract, as I mentioned, to Atari to do the foreign language versions of Atari, and then later we did the programming of the upgrade for the AtariWriter. But in the middle of '84, I believe, Datasoft was approached by the Gillette Corporation, and as I understand it, at the time, Gillette made an offer to purchase Datasoft. So we were all excited, and there were some executives from Gillette who came and met with us and talked to us, and how excited they were about the razor and the razor blade ideas that they had. They were just going to produce reams of software products, and they intended, at least from their discussions, to use a lot of the software that we had been generating, because all of the games that we were generating and all the productivity software that we were generating were being produced on at least 2 or 3 of the platforms, unless they were under specific contract, like the Macintosh or the Mindset. And so the sale went through, and about a month or 6 weeks after that, I received a call and said, well, I want you to shut down the operation, and everything gets shipped back down to Northridge. And after some discussion, it seemed that they had really looked at what they thought was being produced out of that office, and thought that they could probably produce it just as well out of the Southern California office at less expense. So in the middle to third quarter of '84, we basically shuttered the office, and everybody was cast to the wind.
There was a Gary Furr did some software for the TRS-80, and I'm wondering if that was you, if that was Datasoft, if that was someone else?
I don't remember. I didn't do any that I recall now specifically myself.
Okay.
I did design some graphic software for the Mindset, which was never commercially sold, I don't think. And we, as an office, we did software for the Macintosh that was presented in the rollout at, I think, Moscone Center in early 1984, when the Macintosh was introduced.
Well, you had mentioned you had done some other projects at Atari besides AtariWriter, and we kind of glossed over that. Is there anything that you can recall that was interesting there?
Well, I did some design work early on a series of products that were going to be used for teachers in grade schools and middle schools, basically, to assist with their class presentation. And unfortunately, the early name that we came up with was the Atari Instructional Development System. So if you think about that for a second, the Atari Instructional Development System and we were talking about that in 1983, and the product really died on the vine, and it really, once the acronym became associated, there was a fairly quick rush to the exits on the product line. So that died, and there were other products that I had become involved with early in 1983 while we were still in the process of rolling out AtariWriter that used the Atari computer to capture motion, and a number of us went down to Southern California to a place that I honestly don't remember the name of, but it was where a number of tennis pros went and developed their techniques. And so someone there had been using the Atari to capture screen images of live motion for these tennis players to play back to them to show where their issues were. And we were talking about productizing that product and selling it. And then that was my effort, and that was ended when I left Atari.
Nice. What haven't I asked you about the Atari or Datasoft days that I should have?
Well, I think we've covered most everything that is certainly relevant. I wish there had been some kind of copy protection back in the 80s so that my 25,000 copies would have ballooned up a little more. But, in hindsight, I enjoyed creating the printer drivers. I actually very much enjoyed working at Atari. There were hectic days, the early days, and I think I exited Atari at just about the right time.
What do you do today?
Well, today I'm actually retired. The last 16 years of my career, I was an engineering contractor to the FAA, and I helped develop and maintained all of the specifications for what's called the Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast System that is now being rolled out literally all over the world on almost every aircraft in the world. And it's the definition of digital communications between aircraft and from the aircraft to the ground and vice versa. So that the pilot in the cockpit will actually be able at some point in the future to see the exact same image that the controller on the ground is seeing, being able to see every airplane within maybe 100-mile or possibly 150-mile radius of his current location.
Wow. As
well as seeing all kinds of weather and terrain and all the other things that a pilot would like to see. So awesome. I finally got to use my aerospace engineering training in about the last maybe 20 years of my career, but my wife and I are now retired as of August of last year.
Oh, excellent. And how are you using your retirement?
Well, we ended our retirement in New Jersey. We both worked for the FAA at the technical facility in Atlantic City, and our home actually sold much faster than we expected. So I was stuck with a whole to-do list of things that I was going to do before we got the house sold. And so I had to bring them with me to Florida. And what I've been doing literally for about the last year is digitizing all of my 33, 45, and 78 RPM vinyl albums into MP3 files, and also somewhere on the order of 150 cassette tapes into MP3 files. and I'm down to about, I think, the last 4 or 5 cassette tapes, which brings me in the order of 6,400 or 6,500 tracks.
Wow.
So that's what I've been doing for the last year, and going forward, I'm not sure what I'm going to do when I finish that task.
Well, there's a lot of new printers out in the last 30 years. I'm sure you could write some printer drivers.
Well, yeah. When I even look at the list of drivers that I supported, some of them are still around. Some of them went by the wayside. But every time I use Microsoft Word, I think, geez, how many of those drivers did I spawn originally? Because they'll support 1,000 drivers. Today, you just load a piece of software, and your printer comes maybe with a CD that you load, and maybe you just get it off the internet. But things have moved a far ways from my bedroom, creating a individual file and loading it to a floppy disk.
Yeah, yes, indeed. All right, I think this will be my last question. If you could send a message to the Atari computer users who are still playing with their machines and listening to this podcast, what would you tell them?
Well, it's been a long run. I'm sure that you enjoyed using your hardware and you enjoy everything about it. I frankly, at times, wish I still had my hardware, which I got rid of in the late 90s. But good luck and best wishes. I really enjoyed my time with the Atari, and I hope you enjoy your time with the Atari.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gary.
Thank you so much for calling.
If you enjoyed these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.